I would like to use this diagram to describe a possible model of our minds. Because focusing strictly on a material model of human evolution and human existence over the course of time, before we have solid records, really, creates a situation where we have to generate really elaborate explanations for a lot of the complex behaviors that rose out of essentially the late or early Bronze Age and the time preceding, where we have really good records. So all of these behaviors, symbolic behaviors really is what I'm referring to. They, again, the explanations have to be seen through a material evolutionary model based on pressure and survival and things that create material gains, essentially. So part of the problem here is that the psychologists don't make the leap of creating a model that allows another avenue of thought, because the biologists really have a narrative. So it becomes a situation where there's no room or there's no need for any other types of explanations. Thus, the need for seemingly strange explanations sometimes for some of the early symbolic behaviors of humans. So if we have a model that is separate from that as a primary motivation, which is basically material survival and reproductive instincts, then we can have a different framework to explain some of those behaviors. Create a psychological model that allows room other than these primal instincts to explain them away. And really, human civilization and human behavior seems to be really the same over the course of history. And we have to assume that before we have a lot of observational evidence, it would be the same. It was the same. There'd be no reason to think that it wasn't. So that's the perspective that I'm taking here. That our ancestors were like us, and there's no reason to think that they weren't. There's no reason to think that suddenly they were different. Now, obviously, I believe there were differences, and we're not going to assume that everything was the same the whole time. But generally, the framework here is that there were sorts of crystals of thought or crystals of behavior that continued through various environmental changes and cultural shifts. Now, one of the great leaps that psychologists made starting in the 1940s with the behaviorists like Pavlov and Watson and ultimately Skinner, who really cemented this way of doing things, this methodology and this idea into Western psychology. For it's still pretty massive way of thinking. And that way of thinking is that, and this is again called behaviorism, and this idea is that thoughts and mental activity is largely unobservable and subjective. So psychologists wanted to really finally separate themselves from philosophy. So they decided they were going to make the logical leap, which is pretty intuitive and it makes sense. There's no argument that behaviors represent thought. Since we can't see thought, and it's largely subjective based on self-reports and what people are telling you about their thoughts, and arguably whether people are observing the right information is a whole nother psychological problem. So there were a lot of problems with the methodology there. So they wanted to really separate from that subjective that messiness. So behaviors were chosen to replace that. No longer they didn't need mental constructs and explanations that involved deductions made from unobservable data, because they were simply going to measure behaviors and reproduce the behaviors and run controlled experiments and gain predictable outcomes using variables and hypothesis testing and more strict scientific procedures that measured behaviors instead of thoughts. So behaviorism really grounded themselves in that idea. And basically, I'm proposing the same thing. So if thoughts represent behaviors, there's no reason to simply observe those if behaviors represent thoughts, then there's no reason to interpret the behaviors from one perspective, which is the dominant perspective, essentially the Darwinian model, which is that the symbolic behaviors of human beings are based on a survival pressure for reproduction or some cultural avenue that at the end of it was for material or reproductive gains. And the psychological aspect is largely just taken out of the equation. And that's fine. And here we will follow the traditional psychological model that the behaviors do represent thoughts of some sort, and those thoughts might not be the product of what's traditionally thought, which is the Darwinian ingredients. So this psychological model will open up that possibility that there might be a sort of Darwinian motivation behind a lot of the behaviors that are very interesting to cognitive psychologists that want to know how human beings became so deeply symbolic. So this model, or this diagram, will hopefully try to explain some of that. And over the next few videos, I'm going to try to make to really articulate this and bring this out, that there is a lot of basic mainstream psychological, I wouldn't even say evidence, just thinking that allows for a very spiritual or metaphysical component in human thinking that is a equally valid explanation for a lot of the behaviors that are observed as far as early human symbolic artwork and representing both realistic elements of the environment and what appear to be very unrealistic. So I would like to start with just a basic explanation, because again, a lot of it will be grounded in basic Western psychology. However, I would like to add into it, interpret some of the psychological thinking a little bit differently, so that there is room for another interpretation of early human behavior. And I have this model that just basically breaks it down, and I'm going to go through this very briefly. We have first, I would like to start with the yellow ring, which is our basic consciousness, which I described a little bit in the previous video. Consciousness is basically just like we think about it, not necessarily consciousness as in big C consciousness, but our conscious functioning, the stuff we're aware of. So our perceptions and things like that, which basically means exactly what it means in everyday life. There's no different jargon explanation for that. Working memory is a slight jargon term, which basically is your attention and what you're thinking about at any given moment. It's sometimes interchangeably called short-term memory. It's a part of our explicit memory area in the framework of what we were talking about last time. So working memory is basically what you're thinking about right now. Whatever you're thinking about right now is your working memory. And there's different sensorial memories. We have visual memory, auditory memory, tactile memory, and various different types of memories and processes. So working memory takes all that information in and creates some sort of coherent picture. It aggregates all that data from the different sensorial inputs. Also, I'm not going to continue on with working memory. You can check it out. There's the most common working memory model is the Rapov's Baddeley model. Maybe I'll make another video about that. But it's basically your attention and what you're thinking about at any given moment, what you're listening to, what you're thinking, your basic moment-to-moment thoughts. And also your long-term memory, which is very different than your working memory, because that's basic stored memories. What's in your working memory typically sometimes might make it into your long-term memory if it has an impact, if you think about it, if you try to remember it. So it has a chance to get there, and it's thought that it gets there through longer and deeper processing, emotional processing, all these various different ways. So long-term memories are retrievable memories. They're sometimes abstract emotions that you can't articulate. You remember how you felt. There are also sometimes things that you know, maybe what country you live in, or again, your name, or what somebody looks like we were talking about with the faces. And other types of abstract, conscious bits of knowledge are appraisals, moment-to-moment mood states, feelings, emotions, and things like that. So that's the first sort of big area that we're almost familiar with, our conscious memory, our consciousness, what's conscious to us. Now, the next layer that I would like to talk about is what interfaces with our conscious awareness. And that is the first level of our unconscious. And what that interface means is that sometimes they go back and forth where things that are unconscious become conscious. And very briefly, what that usually takes the form of is something like an intuition. And that could be potentially one psychological theory is that you are processing information that you don't have access to the analytics, like sometimes you do when you're consciously processing a situation. And you only have access, in this particular case, when you're having an intuition, to the end result, essentially the answer, the product. But you don't have access to the analytical steps or what's going on to get there. It just comes up to you as a feeling and bubbles up to your consciousness as something that you wind up praising. Like maybe you feel odd or something feels off and you have to get out of that situation. So that's what that interface might mean. It also can go the opposite way. It doesn't always come from your more unconscious areas to your conscious areas, or one's conscious areas. It could go the opposite direction. Something can be explicit and then it becomes implicit. And a good example of that is learning to play a musical instrument, where in the beginning you really have to practice and you really have to focus to play the most basic things, and you're thinking about every single note. And then years later you have to not think to play well. You don't really think about it anymore. You forget that you're playing according to these particular rules, especially things that are improvisational. For instance, something like jazz. Also, maybe driving a stick shift where at first you have to really pay attention to it and you're stalling the car out and you're having trouble. And then eventually you're not even thinking about it anymore. It becomes implicit. So explicit knowledge and very hard to deal with, very conscious things can become implicit and automatic. So it can go both ways. So that's the second level. So it converts abstract knowledge into semantic concepts sometimes, and sometimes it goes the opposite direction. And in this layer, are also archetypes. And archetypes are a very common concept I'm sure everybody is familiar with. And these are actually interface with the next level, some of this material, because the levels are split because our unconscious does have two levels. One level is directly interfacing with stuff that we can access. For instance, the things that might have become implicit over time. Or you can think deeply about why you might have that, for instance, intuition about a particular situation. And you can retroactively analyze it and come up with a theory on why you felt strange and felt like you had to leave or something like that. You can go back and forth, and some things you might not really be able to. So some of these archetypes are in that level where we do have a biological potential reason for having them. For instance, the archetype of mother as being nurturing and loving. And these types of things are biologically interwoven into us. So they can also go deeper, and there also can be social archetypes. So archetypes largely exist in that level, and they can go back and forth between all of the levels because sometimes they are based on biological impulses, and sometimes they're based on constructs, social constructs. So they also exist in that level. Deeper, beyond all of that, is what I would like to propose as a second level of our unconscious mind, which doesn't really come into the discussion with modern psychology with what they consider to be implicit and learned. And it also isn't really something that they would consider to be genetic, like I was discussing earlier. And it's also not one of the things that you would consider to be biologically, behaviorally genetic, not even psychologically, like the mother archetype, but explained away by some innate biological process, like chewing or some involuntary process. So it wouldn't even be able to be rationally explained by one of those elaborate explanations. And these are things like spiritual impulses, things that create situations where systems are created, allegorical systems wind up being created, that really have no clear motivation other than a cultural cohesion, which is typically the explanation. But there's no psychological principle that allows for that other than, again, a social explanation. So there is no explanation for the more autistic or individualized, idiosyncratic kind of sage or devotee or sort of shaman type. These that really do drive this influence in the culture. So this model creates a spot for that type of thinking, that must be also just like biological processes that are deeper than a lot of our behavioral processes that are conditioned, that psychologists can predict and replicate and tinker with in laboratories like the behaviorists, and are comparative and cross-species, which is, again, shown in hundreds of thousands of experiments by the behaviorists for decades with largely rats. But this model allows for that sort of thinking, a sort of similar place, a so-called involuntary thoughts that are more spiritual, that streamline through various cultural shifts. The way that they are presented differ, but the impulse to have them remains. So this model will allow for that, which is critical for a paleopsychology of human development.